Tsutsumi Sakamoto. On November 4, 1989, a young lawyer in Yokohama put his infant son to bed, kissed his wife goodnight, and locked the front door of their apartment. By morning, all three of them were gone. No trace of a struggle, no sign of forced entry, just an empty apartment and a silence that would stretch on for 6 years. Tsutsumi Sakamoto was 33 years old, and he had made the kind of enemies most attorneys never have to worry about. As a member of the Yokohama Bar Association, he had taken on Aum Shinrikyo, a doomsday cult that was gaining thousands of followers across Japan. Families were reaching out to him in desperation, begging him to help get their loved ones out. And Sakamoto answered. That October, a Japanese television network called TBS made a decision that would eventually cost 3 lives. They had filmed an interview with Sakamoto, but before it aired, they secretly showed the unedited tape to senior members of Aum Shinrikyo. The cult pressured TBS to cancel the broadcast, and TBS complied. Days later, one of the cult's top operatives, a man named Kiyohide Hayakawa, paid Sakamoto a visit and warned him to back off. Sakamoto did not back off. So on that night in November, a team of Aum members broke into the apartment. They had actually tried the day before, stalking Sakamoto at a train station with hypodermic needles filled with potassium chloride. But he never showed up. It was Culture Day, a national holiday, and he stayed home with his family. The operatives returned the next night instead. They struck Tsutsumi with a hammer and injected him with potassium chloride. His wife Satoko suffered the same fate. Their infant son Tatsuhiko did not survive the night either. What came next was a burial designed so that no one would ever connect the 3 deaths. The cult sealed the bodies in metal drums and drove them to 3 separate prefectures. Tsutsumi was buried in Niigata, Satoko in Toyama, and Tatsuhiko in Nagano. They destroyed dental records, burned the bed sheets, and dumped the tools they used into the ocean. And for 6 years, it worked. Kanagawa police investigated, but the case went nowhere. What makes this even more painful is that in 1990, one of the perpetrators, a man named Kazuaki Okazaki, actually defected from Aum and sent anonymous letters to the police. He included maps and photographs. He was practically handing them the case. But at the time, investigators could not verify the information, and the letters went cold along with everything else. How does a case this devastating go unsolved for 6 full years when someone on the inside is trying to hand it over? It was not until March 20th, 1995, that everything changed. That was the morning Aum Shinrikyo released sarin nerve gas on the Tokyo subway, taking 13 lives and injuring thousands. The attack triggered the largest criminal investigation in Japanese history. And suddenly, Aum members were being arrested by the dozens. Under interrogation, cult members began to talk. In September of 1995, confessions finally led police to the 3 burial sites. After 6 years underground, only skeletal remains were left. The man behind all of it was Shoko Asahara, the cult's founder and leader. He had personally ordered the Sakamoto family eliminated. The list of people convicted for their roles included Okazaki, Tomomasa Nakagawa, Satoru Hashimoto, Hayakawa, and Tomomitsu Niimi. One key figure never stood trial at all. Hideo Murai, Aum's chief scientist, was fatally attacked by an assailant in April 1995 while being escorted by police. On July 6, 2018, Asahara and 6 of his followers were hanged, including Nakagawa, Niimi, and Hayakawa. 20 days later, on July 26th, the remaining 6, including Okazaki and Hashimoto, were executed as well. It was the largest mass execution in modern Japanese history. Where does the case stand today? All of the perpetrators involved in the Sakamoto case have been executed. TBS eventually admitted its role in exposing Sakamoto to the cult. But by then, a father, a mother, and their infant son were already buried across 3 prefectures, and it had taken a terrorist attack to find them. The Sakamoto case was a crime hidden inside a cult. The case that follows was built on a different kind of concealment, one where the weapon was trust and the disguise was companionship. Chisako Kakehi. When a 75-year-old man drops dead at the dinner table, most people assume it was his heart. When his new wife barely sheds a tear and starts asking about the inheritance, a few eyebrows go up. But when investigators realize this is the latest in a long line of men who got close to the same woman and never grew old, what you have is not grief. What you have is a pattern. Chisako Kakehi was a former bank and printing factory worker living near Kyoto, and for years, the men who entered her life had a way of leaving it permanently. She moved through matchmaking agencies with a very specific filter. She was looking for men who were elderly, preferably wealthy, and ideally without children or close family who might come asking questions. The death that finally tripped her up happened in December of 2013. She had married a man named Isao Kakehi just about 2 months earlier. He was 75. One evening, he collapsed and died. And when an autopsy was performed, doctors found lethal levels of cyanide in his heart, blood, and stomach. That result changed everything, because up until that point, most of the men connected to Kakehi had simply been cremated, their deaths chalked up to illness, with no autopsies ever performed. Her method was deceptively simple. She would take ordinary health supplement capsules, the kind her victims already swallowed every day, empty them out, and refill them with powdered cyanide. She had access to the poison through a printing factory where she had once worked. The victims trusted her. They took the pills without a second thought. One man, a 78-year-old named Toshiaki Suehiro, collapsed within about 15 minutes of having lunch with her in December of 2007. He survived, but the damage was severe. Brain injury, impaired vision. He died roughly a year and a half later from an unrelated illness. He was the only one of her targets who lived long enough to be counted as an attempted taking of life, rather than a completed one. The investigation widened fast once Isao's autopsy came back. Police arrested her in November of 2014, about 11 months after his death. At her apartment, they found empty capsules, medical books with pages on poisoning bookmarked, and the piece of evidence that sealed the case: a plastic bag with cyanide residue buried inside a discarded potted plant. They also discovered that a previous fiancé who had died in a 2012 motorcycle crash still had cyanide in his body. By the time prosecutors laid out the full picture, the numbers were difficult to absorb. The court established that Kakehi had collected more than 1 billion yen, roughly $8.8 million, in life insurance payouts and inheritances from the men in her life. She reportedly lost most of it through unsuccessful financial trading. How does someone take the lives of partner after partner for years without a single autopsy raising the alarm? Her trial was a spectacle. In court, she admitted taking her husband's life, telling the judge she did it because he gave other women tens of millions of yen but would not give her even a single yen. Then she took it back and claimed she had no memory of saying it. On November 7th, 2017, the Kyoto District Court sentenced her to death. The Osaka High Court upheld the sentence in 2019, and the Supreme Court of Japan finalized it on June 29, 2021. Rejecting an appeal based on dementia. The justices noted that she had used matchmaking services to seek out elderly victims one after another, poisoning them after earning their trust. She never showed remorse. At one point during the proceedings, she told reporters that even if she were executed tomorrow, she would die smiling. Where does the case stand now? On December 26, 2024, guards at the Osaka Detention Center found Kakehi lying in her cell. She was rushed to a hospital, but she was gone. She was 78 years old. The cause of her death was never officially determined. She passed the way her victims did, suddenly and without warning. The next case shares one quality with Kakehi's. The perpetrator lived undetected for years. But where Kakehi hid behind companionship, this woman hid behind a series of surgically altered faces. Kazuko Fukuda. In 1982, Japan had a 15-year statute of limitations on taking a life. That meant if you committed the act and managed to stay hidden for 15 years, the law could no longer touch you. Most people never think about a rule like that, because most people are never in a position where it matters. Kazuko Fukuda thought about it every single day for almost 15 years. Fukuda was 34 years old and working as a cabaret hostess in Matsuyama, a city on the island of Shikoku. She was buried in debt to consumer finance companies, and the pressure was crushing her. On August 19, 1982, she went to the home of a fellow hostess named Atsuko Yasuoka. Yasuoka was 31 years old. Fukuda took her life by strangulation and stole roughly 9.5 million yen in cash and goods, including furniture and a savings passbook. Her husband helped conceal the body and urged her to turn herself in. She ran instead. What followed was one of the longest and most elaborate fugitive runs in Japanese criminal history. Fukuda moved from city to city across the country, picking up jobs under false names, living in rented rooms, and never staying anywhere long enough to be remembered. She changed her name. She changed her appearance. And then she changed her face. Over the course of her years on the run, she underwent multiple rounds of plastic surgery on her nose and eyes, reshaping her features so drastically that even people who had known her before would not have recognized her on the street. The Japanese media eventually gave her a nickname that stuck: the Woman of Seven Faces. As the years passed and the 15-year clock kept ticking, police in Matsuyama grew desperate. With no leads and time running out, the Matsuyama Higashi Police Department did something that had never been done before in Japan. They offered a 1 million yen reward for information leading to Fukuda's capture, and they issued a prepaid telephone card printed with her photograph, distributing it to the public like a wanted poster you could carry in your wallet. It worked, barely. A customer at a small Oden restaurant in Fukui Prefecture looked at the woman working behind the counter and felt a jolt of recognition. She was going by the name Yukiko Nakamura, but something about her did not sit right. The customer contacted police, and on July 29, 1997, after 14 years and 11 months on the run, Kazuko Fukuda was arrested. She was 49 years old. She had been living under a false identity and surviving by staying just invisible enough that no one ever looked twice. When detectives sat her down, she tried one last move. She claimed that a male accomplice, who had since died, was the one who actually committed the act. The lead detective on the case, Kunihiko Nakai, was not buying it. His team tracked down the dead man's personal diary, and the entries proved he had been in Tokyo at the time. He was not in Ehime Prefecture, and he was certainly not in Matsuyama. What does it say about a justice system when an 11-hour margin is all that separates accountability from impunity? Fukuda was formally indicted on August 18, 1997. According to reports, the indictment came through just 11 hours before the statute of limitations was set to expire. The Takamatsu District Court sentenced her to life imprisonment in May of 1999. Her defense team tried to argue that the act stemmed from a personal, emotional obsession with the victim, but the court rejected that framing entirely. The Takamatsu High Court upheld the sentence in 2000. While in prison, Fukuda wrote an autobiography called Valley of Tears, in which she detailed not just her years on the run, but also the abuse she had suffered as a teenager during a previous incarceration in Matsuyama Prison, where she had been victimized by Yakuza inmates. The book drew public attention to conditions inside Japanese women's prisons. Fukuda passed away in 2005. Where does the case stand today? Her case became one of the landmark examples cited by legal reformers who argued that Japan's statute of limitations was a moral failure. It took more than a decade of debate, but in 2010, Japan officially abolished the statute of limitations for taking a life. The next case began an ocean away, in a city already under the spotlight. This time, the trail did not grow cold because of a fugitive. It grew cold because the evidence could not point to what everyone believed. Lucy Blackman. On July 1, 2000, a 21-year-old British woman named Lucy Blackman went on a paid date in Tokyo and never came back. She was a former flight attendant from Sevenoaks, Kent, who had come to Japan to work as a hostess at a club called Casablanca in the Roppongi nightlife district. In the world of Roppongi hostess bars, a dohan was a common arrangement. A client paying to take a hostess out before her shift, usually dinner or drinks. Lucy left for one of these dates on that July afternoon, and that was the last time anyone at the club saw her alive. A few days later, a phone call came in claiming that Lucy had joined a new religion and would not be returning. Her friends did not believe it for a second. Her father, Tim Blackman, flew to Tokyo and launched a public campaign to find her. He held press conferences, spoke to Japanese media, and even lobbied British Prime Minister Tony Blair during the G8 summit in Okinawa. For months, the case dominated headlines in both Japan and the United Kingdom. Then, on February 9, 2001, police found her. Her remains were recovered from a shallow grave beneath a bathtub inside a seaside cave at Aburatsubo in the Miura area of Kanagawa Prefecture, just a few hundred meters from a property belonging to a man named Joji Obara. The condition of the remains was such that a cause of death could not be established. Obara was a wealthy property investor, born Kim Sung-jong in 1952. He was a Zainichi Korean who had become a Japanese citizen and built a fortune in real estate. But behind the wealth was a pattern of predatory behavior. When police searched his properties, they found hundreds of homemade videotapes. On them, Obara had recorded himself drugging women with chloroform and sedatives and assaulting them while they were unconscious. Investigators believe the number of victims captured on those tapes numbered somewhere between 150 and 400. One of those tapes contained footage linked to another death entirely. In 1992, an Australian woman named Carida Ridgway had died under similar circumstances after spending time with Obara. Buried in his belongings, police found a diary entry in which he had written that he had used too much chloroform on her. Could a man with hundreds of recorded victims and a diary documenting a prior death truly be acquitted? Obara was arrested in April of 2001, and his trial stretched across years. On April 24, 2007, the Tokyo District Court convicted him of assaulting 9 women and of the manslaughter of Carida Ridgway. But he was acquitted in connection with Lucy Blackman. The judge ruled there was not enough direct evidence tying him to her death, a result that stunned a country where the conviction rate exceeds 99%. Prosecutors appealed. On December 16, 2008, the Tokyo High Court convicted Obara of abducting Lucy and of disposing of her remains, though still not of the act itself. The Supreme Court rejected his final appeal in December of 2010, and a life sentence was locked in. There was one more dimension to this case that divided people for years. In 2006, Tim Blackman accepted a 100 million yen payment, roughly £450,000, described as condolence money, from a college friend of Obara. Under Japanese law, such payments are legal and are not uncommon in criminal cases. But Lucy's mother, Jane Steer, was appalled. She had turned down an earlier offer of about £200,000. The presiding judge stated clearly that the payment had no bearing on the verdict, but the controversy over it never fully faded. Tim Blackman used part of the money to establish the Lucy Blackman Trust, now called LBT Global, which assists British nationals in crisis overseas. Where does the case stand now? Joji Obara is serving his life sentence and maintains his innocence. The trust established in Lucy's name continues to operate and has assisted thousands of people since its founding. Obara used drugs, isolation, and a camera to control his victims. The case that follows required none of that. One man used psychological coercion so complete that he turned the members of a family against each other, and the result was a crime that prosecutors would call without comparison in the criminal history of Japan. Futoshi Matsunaga. There are crimes that are hard to explain, and then there are crimes that seem almost impossible to believe, even after a court has proven every detail. The Kitakyushu confinement case is that kind of crime. No weapons, no poison, no elaborate plan to lure strangers. Instead, one man used psychological coercion so total and so relentless that he convinced the members of a family to turn on each other, one by one, with their own hands. Futoshi Matsunaga was born in 1961 and grew up to become a con artist and a manipulator of extraordinary ability. His common-law partner was a woman named Junko Ogata, who was herself a victim of his abuse long before the deaths began. Matsunaga's method was control. He used fraud-induced debt to trap people financially, then escalated to physical abuse, electric shocks delivered through stun devices, starvation, and confinement, until his victims were so broken and so terrified that they would do whatever he told them to do. The first death came on February 26, 1996. A man named Kumio Toraya, 34 years old, was subjected to prolonged abuse and died. Matsunaga then turned to Toraya's teenage daughter and convinced her that she was the one responsible for her own father's death. She believed him. That lie became a weapon Matsunaga would use to keep her under his control for years. Between December of 1997 and June of 1998, 6 members of Junko Ogata's own family lost their lives. Her father, Takashi, 61. Her mother, Shizumi, 58. Her sister Rieko, 33. Her brother-in-law, Kazuya, 38, who died in April of 1998 from the effects of prolonged deprivation and abuse, and 2 young children, Yuki and Aya. All of them perished inside what was supposed to be a family home, their deaths orchestrated by a man who had made obedience a condition of survival. The remains were disposed of. Some were placed in the ocean near the Kunisaki Peninsula, others flushed down drains. No human remains were ever recovered. When this case finally reached a courtroom, the prosecution had no physical evidence at all. Everything rested on testimony. And the reason this case ever reached a courtroom at all is because of one person, Kumio Toraya's surviving daughter. By early 2002, she was a teenager and had spent years under Matsunaga's surveillance. Around the end of January, she managed to escape. Matsunaga's people caught her and brought her back. Around February 15th, she was subjected to further abuse as punishment. And then she escaped again. This time, she made it to her grandparents and to the police. She told them everything, that she had been confined, that she had been harmed, and that she believed she had been responsible for her own father's death. What does it take for a court to convict when there are no remains, no forensic evidence, and the only proof is testimony? What started as a confinement investigation became one of the most complex prosecutions in Japanese legal history. The couple were arrested shortly afterward, and 4 children being held were rescued. The trial at the Fukuoka District Court's Kokura branch produced death sentences for both Matsunaga and Ogata on September 28, 2005. On September 26, 2007, the Fukuoka High Court upheld Matsunaga's death sentence, but reduced Ogata's to life imprisonment, finding that Matsunaga had exerted such coercive control over her that she could not be held equally responsible. The Supreme Court finalized both sentences on December 12, 2011. Where does the case stand now? As of 2026, Futoshi Matsunaga remains on death row. He has not been executed. Junko Ogata is serving her life sentence. The case is often cited as the only known instance in Japan of a serial offending duo, and several Japanese media outlets at the time declined to publish the full details, determining that the level of what had occurred was beyond what the public should be asked to absorb. 7 people lost their lives in a single household. And the only reason the world knows any of it is because a teenage girl who had been told she was a perpetrator escaped twice, walked into a police station, and told the truth. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Kazuyoshi Miura. In November of 1981, a Japanese businessman named Kazuyoshi Miura was on vacation in Los Angeles with his wife Kazumi. She was about 28 years old and the mother of a young child. On November 18th, in a downtown parking area, 2 unknown assailants attacked them. Kazumi was shot in the head. Kazuyoshi was shot in the leg. He survived and was rushed to a local hospital. She did not survive, at least not in any way that mattered. Kazumi was left in a coma and was eventually flown back to Japan, where she lingered for about a year before she passed. From his hospital bed in Los Angeles, Kazuyoshi Miura held a press conference and put on a performance that would fool a nation. He described the attack in emotional detail, his voice breaking, his body bandaged. He condemned the violence of the city. He positioned himself as a grieving husband and a victim of random American street crime. And his delivery was so convincing that the story became front-page news in Japan and an embarrassment for Los Angeles, which was at the time preparing to host the 1984 Olympic Games. For a while, people believed him. That began to change in 1984, when a Japanese magazine called Shukan Bunshun published an investigation that peeled back the surface. Reporters discovered that Miura had taken out life insurance policies on Kazumi worth approximately $1.4 million. An actress named Michiko Yazawa came forward and told investigators that Miura had tried to recruit her to harm Kazumi, and that an earlier attempt had already taken place. In August of 1981, just 3 months before the Los Angeles incident, someone had attacked Kazumi with a hammer at the new Otani Hotel in LA. She survived that time. Police also connected Miura to the 1979 death of a former lover named Chizuko Shiraishi, whose skeletal remains were identified in 1984. Japanese police arrested Miura in 1985. He was convicted of the attempted attack at the hotel, the one involving Yazawa, and served time. Then in 1988, he was charged in connection with Kazumi's death. In 1994, a court convicted him and sentenced him to life in prison. But the Tokyo High Court overturned the conviction on appeal. And in 2003, Japan's Supreme Court acquitted him entirely, ruling that the evidence of a conspiracy was not strong enough to sustain a guilty verdict. The actual assailant in the parking lot was never identified, and without that link, the case fell apart. After his release, Miura reinvented himself. He gave public lectures. He appeared on talk shows. He seemed to believe the story was over. It was not. In February of 2008, authorities in Los Angeles had him arrested on the island of Saipan. The plan was to extradite him to the United States and try him under American law. Miura fought the extradition. His legal team argued double jeopardy, that he had already been tried and acquitted in Japan for the same crime. An LA court eventually dismissed the charge on those grounds, but allowed a separate conspiracy charge to move forward. He was transported to a Los Angeles jail. How does a case survive acquittal in one country only to be revived in another? On the night of October 10, 2008, guards found Kazuyoshi Miura hanging in his cell. The official ruling was suicide. His attorney, Mark Garagos, publicly disputed that conclusion. A private pathologist hired by the defense claimed there were injuries on Miura's body that were more consistent with a struggle than with someone who had taken his own life. The dispute was never resolved. Miura was 61 years old. Where does the case stand now? The case left behind more questions than answers. Miura was acquitted in Japan and never convicted of the Los Angeles incident. His death in custody was ruled a suicide, though his legal team contested that finding. The identity of the person who shot Kazumi Miura in that parking lot has never been established. Japanese media coverage of the case was so intense over the years that it drew its own criticism, with journalists accused of crossing ethical lines to keep the story alive. The Miura case ended in a jail cell on the other side of the Pacific. The case that follows unfolded at a neighborhood gathering far closer to home, where a pot of communal curry was all it took to end 4 lives and leave a community in shock. Masumi Hayashi. On July 25, 1998, the Sonobe neighborhood of Wakayama City held its annual summer festival. It was the kind of event that happened in neighborhoods all over Japan. Families came out, children moved between the stalls, and volunteers stirred large pots of communal curry over open flames, the way they had done every year for as long as anyone could remember. People lined up with their bowls, sat down together, and ate. By that evening, dozens of them had collapsed. By the next morning, 4 of them had lost their lives and 63 more had been hospitalized. The dead were Takatoshi Taninaka, 64, and Takaaki Tanaka, 53. The president and vice president of the local neighborhood council, along with Hirataka Hayashi, a young student, and Miyuki Tori, a teenager. Initial reports pointed to food poisoning, some kind of bacterial contamination, but toxicology results told a different story. The curry had been laced with at least 130 grams of arsenic trioxide, enough poison to take more than 100 lives. Suspicion turned quickly to a woman named Masumi Hayashi, a former insurance saleswoman who lived in the neighborhood. A high school student told investigators that Hayashi had been alone near the curry pots before the meal was served. That testimony became the starting point for the entire case. Hayashi's husband, Kenji, worked as a pest exterminator, a job that required him to keep arsenic-based compounds on hand, which meant their household had documented access to arsenic. Forensic scientists brought in equipment from the Spring 8 synchrotron facility, one of the most powerful X-ray analysis tools in the world, and performed a detailed chemical comparison. They matched the specific signature of the arsenic in the curry to samples recovered from the Hayashi home. Investigators also uncovered a long-running side business of insurance fraud. Masumi and Kenji had filed multiple suspicious claims over the years, and detectives found evidence suggesting she had previously administered arsenic to her own husband and at least one acquaintance in separate, earlier incidents. She was arrested on October 4, 1998, and indicted on December 29th of that year. The question that would hang over the entire trial was motive. Prosecutors suggested she had been angry at her neighbors, but they never pinpointed a specific reason. There was no confession. Hayashi exercised her right to remain silent through much of the proceedings and maintained her innocence throughout. How do you sentence someone to death when there is no confession, no clear motive, and the entire case rests on circumstantial forensic evidence? On December 10, 2002, the Wakayama District Court sentenced her to death. The conviction rested entirely on circumstantial evidence, the witness testimony, the forensic arsenic match, her access to the poison, and the pattern of prior incidents. The Osaka High Court upheld the sentence on June 28, 2005. The Supreme Court of Japan finalized the death penalty on April 21, 2009. Hayashi has spent the years since fighting for a retrial. Her legal team has argued that the poison in the curry was actually cyanide, not arsenic, and that the forensic analysis used to convict her was fundamentally flawed. Both the Wakayama District Court and the Osaka High Court have rejected these petitions, the most recent dismissal coming in late January of 2025. Each rejection has been met with renewed appeals from her defense, and the legal battle has now lasted longer than the original investigation and trial combined. The case also left scars well beyond the courtroom. In the months following the poisoning, copycat incidents broke out across Japan, as other individuals attempted to replicate the method by tainting food in public settings. The wave of imitations added a second layer of fear to a country already reeling from the original event. Where does the case stand now? As of early 2025, Masumi Hayashi remains on death row, 63 years old, still insisting she is innocent. The case has become a touchstone in the ongoing debate over Japan's use of the death penalty, precisely because the conviction was built entirely on circumstantial forensic evidence, without a confession or a clearly established reason for the crime. Her husband, Kenji, was convicted of insurance fraud and served a 6-year term. The Wakayama case is a death sentence built on evidence alone. The case that follows had something the Wakayama prosecution never did: a perpetrator who admitted what he had done, and a manhunt so dramatic that the fugitive performed surgery on his own face to stay hidden. Lindsay Hawker. On March 26, 2007, a 22-year-old British woman named Lindsay Hawker went to an apartment in Ichikawa, Chiba Prefecture, and never walked out. She was an English teacher at a Nova language school, originally from a village near Coventry. She had come to Japan the way thousands of young British and Australian teachers did every year, to work, to travel, and to build a life in a country she found fascinating. That afternoon, she entered the apartment of a 28-year-old man named Tatsuya Ichihashi. He had previously posed as a potential English student to make contact with her. Once inside, he attacked her. Lindsay lost her life that afternoon. Ichihashi then concealed her remains in a bathtub filled with sand on his apartment balcony. The next day, police came to question Ichihashi about Lindsay's disappearance. The encounter became one of the most criticized failures in modern Japanese law enforcement history. Officers arrived at the apartment building and attempted to speak with him. But Ichihashi charged past them, shoved through the group, and fled. 9 officers were on the scene. Not one of them had a radio to call for backup. He got away clean. They did manage to seize a rucksack he dropped during the escape, but the suspect himself was gone, and he would stay gone for the next 2.5 years, while Lindsay's family waited in England for answers. What followed was a manhunt that covered the entire length of Japan, from Aomori in the far north to Okinawa in the south. Ichihashi slept in internet cafes, parks, and abandoned military bunkers. He picked up cash-in-hand work on construction sites under false names, moving constantly so that no employer or landlord ever got to know him well enough to recognize his face from the wanted posters. And he began to alter his appearance in ways that went far beyond a haircut or a pair of glasses. Using a box cutter, he dug out facial moles from his skin. He removed part of his own lower lip. He reshaped his nose with a needle and thread. Later, on October 24th, 2009, he walked into a cosmetic surgery clinic in Nagoya and paid a doctor to perform a professional rhinoplasty. By this point, the reward for information on his whereabouts had been raised from 1 million yen to 10 million. Could a wanted man really evade capture for years in a country with one of the most advanced surveillance infrastructures in the world? It was a cosmetic surgeon in Nagoya who recognized Ichihashi from the wanted photos and tipped off the police. Then, on November 10th, 2009, a worker at a ferry terminal in Osaka spotted a man trying to board a boat to Okinawa. Something about his face looked wrong. The scars, the shape of the nose. The worker contacted authorities. When officers confronted him at the terminal, Ichihashi did not run this time. He looked at them and confirmed who he was. His trial ran from July 4th to July 12th, 2011. He admitted to the taking of Lindsay's life, but tried to argue that he had covered her mouth to stop her from screaming and did not intend for her to die. The Chiba District Court did not accept that version of events. On July 21, 2011, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment. Lindsay's father, Bill Hawker, had traveled to Japan for the trial and urged the court to impose the death penalty. The family made clear they believed life in prison was not enough for what Ichihashi had done. While in prison, Ichihashi wrote a book about his time as a fugitive titled Until the Arrest. He offered the proceeds to the Hawker family. They declined. One of the strangest details to surface during the investigation was that during his years on the run, Ichihashi had gone on a temple pilgrimage. He told investigators he had been praying that Lindsay Hawker could somehow come back to life, an idea he said he had taken from a novel he had read. Where does the case stand now? Tatsuya Ichihashi is serving his life sentence at a Japanese correctional facility. He has no prospect of release. The case prompted a review of police protocols around suspect detention, and Lindsay's family has continued to honor her memory through advocacy and awareness. Ichihashi altered his own face to stay free. The woman behind the Amagasaki case did not need a disguise. She used family loyalty, financial control, and the slow, methodical destruction of every person who got close to her. Miyoko Sumida. For roughly 25 years, a woman in Amagasaki, Hyogo Prefecture, built a private empire out of other people's lives. She did not recruit followers. She did not start a movement. She simply chose vulnerable people, often through marriage, adoption, or debt, pulled them into her household, and then made them disappear. By the time anyone noticed, at least 8 people were dead, their remains sealed in concrete or hidden beneath floorboards. And the woman responsible was sitting at the center of a network so tangled that investigators would spend years trying to map it. Her name was Miyoko Sumida. She was born in 1948, and over the decades she constructed what prosecutors and tabloids would eventually call the Piranha family, a coercive pseudo-family that spanned at least 6 prefectures. Sumida drew people into her orbit through manipulation, intimidation, and manufactured financial dependence. Once someone owed her, they belonged to her. She assigned roles within the household: a treasurer, a bodyguard, a designated successor, and maintained absolute control through abuse, deprivation, and confinement. The victims were kept in a storage shed on an apartment balcony, given almost nothing to eat or drink. Some were subjected to prolonged mistreatment until they died. Others were forced to participate in the abuse of fellow captives. When someone perished, the remains were handled with cold efficiency. Some were placed inside metal drums, which were then filled with concrete. One drum was dumped in Haina's harbor in Okayama Prefecture. Other remains were wrapped in blankets and hidden beneath the floors of houses Sumida controlled. The confirmed dead include Kazuko Oe, 66, Jiro Hashimoto, in his early 50s, Hisayoshi, 51, Mitsue Ando, 71, a woman named Mariko who was 29, and Takashi Tanimoto, 68. Some sources estimate the total could be higher, but at least 8 have been confirmed. The money was the point. Sumida collected insurance payouts and pension payments from the dead and the missing. She used the proceeds to fund a lifestyle that had nothing to do with the conditions inside her homes. Luxury cars, expensive meals, gambling trips. While her captives went without, she spent freely. How does a network responsible for at least 8 deaths operate for a quarter century without detection? The case broke open in November of 2011, when a woman in her 40s who had been held captive managed to slip away from Sumida's control and reach the police. She described years of confinement and mistreatment. On November 9th, officers searched an Amagasaki warehouse and found the concrete-encased remains of Kazuko Oe inside a metal drum. Sumida and 7 associates were arrested in the weeks and months that followed, with the final arrests extending into late 2012. In October of 2012, 3 more sets of remains were discovered beneath the floor of a house in the city. Each discovery widened the scope of what investigators were dealing with, and the case grew from a suspected kidnapping into one of the largest serial investigations in post-war Japan. Tabloid headlines called Sumida the Empress, but she never answered for any of it in open court. On December 12, 2012, Miyoko Sumida was found dead in her cell at the Hyogo Prefectural Police Headquarters. She had taken her own life. Investigators never got a complete accounting of her crimes, how many people she had harmed, how she chose her victims, or what drove her beyond greed. Her death left those questions permanently unanswered. The remaining defendants were tried at the Kobe District Court under Japan's lay judge system beginning in 2013. One associate received life imprisonment. The others received prison terms reported as more than 10 years each. But without the central figure, the trials could only address pieces of the full picture. Some observers questioned whether Sumida's death was actually self-inflicted. She was found lying down when she died, and investigators had to explain how a person could have ended her life in that position. The doubts were never officially addressed. Where does the case stand now? The surviving defendants have been sentenced. Sumida's death in custody means there will never be a full public accounting of what happened inside the Piranha family network. The case remains one of the longest-running serial offenses in Japanese history, spanning roughly 25 years across 6 prefectures. Miyoko Sumida took her answers to the grave. In the final case, it was not the perpetrator who refused to let go. It was the husband of the victim, a man who kept a crime scene frozen in time for 26 years, waiting for technology to catch up to the blood on his kitchen floor. Namiko Takaba. On November 13, 1999, a 32-year-old woman named Namiko Takaba was found dead in her apartment in Nishi Ward, Nagoya. She had suffered fatal knife wounds to the neck. Her young son, Kohei, was lying beside her on the floor, unharmed but alone. Her husband, Satoru, had been at work when it happened. He came home to find his wife gone and his child waiting in silence next to her. Police arrived to a scene that should have given them everything they needed to find the person responsible. There was blood that did not belong to the victim. The attacker had apparently cut her own hand during the assault and then walked to the apartment sink to wash the wound, leaving clear traces of someone else's blood behind. But in 1999, DNA analysis in Japan was not yet advanced enough to turn that blood into a name. The sample was collected and logged into evidence, but it sat there, unmatched, year after year. The investigation that followed was enormous. More than 100,000 officer deployments were logged. Roughly 5,000 people were interviewed. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, checked alibis, and followed every lead. None of it produced a suspect. The case went cold. And then Satoru Takaba did something that no one expected. He refused to let the apartment be cleaned or altered. He kept everything exactly as it was. The calendar on the wall, the furniture, the blood on the surfaces. He continued paying rent on the unit, about 50,000 yen per month, for 26 years. The total cost came to roughly 22 million yen, about $145,000. He turned his wife's apartment into a sealed evidence vault, preserved against the day when science might finally be able to read what the blood had to say. That day came in 2024. 25 years after Namiko's death, the science had finally caught up. As DNA technology advanced, forensic analysts were able to extract a usable genetic profile from the preserved bloodstains. Investigators identified a woman named Kumiko Yasufuku, born in 1956, as a potential match. She had been a high school classmate of Satoru Takaba, someone from his past, not Namiko's. In August of 2024, police approached Yasufuku and asked her to provide a DNA sample voluntarily. She refused. They came back 2 months later, in October, and this time she agreed to cooperate. The sample matched the blood from the apartment sink. On October 31st, 2024, Kumiko Yasufuku was arrested. She was 68 years old. The motive, as investigators pieced it together, went back decades. Yasufuku had reportedly harbored a one-sided infatuation with Satoru Takaba, dating to their school years. In June of 1999, about 5 months before the incident, she attended a tennis club reunion where she learned that Satoru was happily married. Investigators believe that knowledge triggered her. She had never met Namiko Takaba. The victim had no idea who her attacker was. An unfamiliar lactic acid drink found at the apartment was eventually tied to Yasufuku's presence at the scene. What happens to a case when the law itself might have erased the possibility of justice? The case also carried a legal dimension that reached far beyond one life. When Namiko's life was taken in 1999, Japan's statute of limitations was 15 years. That clock meant the case would have expired in 2014, and no charges could ever be filed. But the law changed. In 2005, the limitation period was extended. In 2010, Japan abolished it entirely. Satoru Takaba and a victims' advocacy group had pushed publicly for that reform. Without their effort, Yasufuku could never have been charged regardless of what the DNA revealed. On March 5, 2026, the Nagoya District Public Prosecutor's Office formally indicted Yasufuku. She was 69. Psychiatric evaluations had found her mentally competent to stand trial. The case is set to proceed as a lay judge trial. Where does the case stand now? The trial has not yet begun. Satoru Takaba learned the identity of the woman charged in connection with his wife's death and had one reaction. He wanted to know why. He told reporters he had no prior contact with Yasufuku. He did not understand the connection. After 26 years of paying rent on the apartment where his wife lost her life, the man who had refused to give up was left with the simplest and most painful question of all. Why? This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.